Welcome back to APAICS Tech Summit. I am Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Congressman Ted Lieu. Congressman Lieu represents California's 36th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives and is serving in his fifth term in Congress and sits on the House Judiciary Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, and Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He was elected by his colleagues to serve as Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus, making him the highest-ranking Asian American to have ever served in House leadership. He is a veteran, having served on active duty and then in the reserves for the Air Force. He retired in 2021 with the rank of colonel. As a legislator, Congressman Lieu has established himself as a leader on artificial intelligence, the environment, cybersecurity, civil liberties, foreign affairs, and veterans. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Lieu.
Hello, I'm Congressman Ted Lieu from Southern California. I want to thank APAICS for hosting this tech summit that brings together community and corporate leaders, elected officials, and subject matter experts in this continuously evolving field of technology. I am particularly pleased that APAICS is hosting this panel on regulatory and policy frameworks for AI. As a recovering computer science major, I am enthralled by AI. I am super excited by all the benefits that AI has provided and will provide to society, but AI can also cause harm. And we need to figure out as a society how we can harness the benefits of AI and mitigate the risks of harm. My view as a lawmaker as to how we should approach AI, I think is best analogized with two large bodies of water. The first is a very large ocean of AI. The second would be a lake of AI. So this very large ocean of AI is all the AI that we don't care about. So for example, if your smart toaster has a preference for making bagels better than wheat toast, we don't care about that. But in this lake of AI, we do care about AI, and the reasons are, I think, in these three buckets. The first is AI that can destroy the world. So there are what are known as autonomous weapons in the Department of Defense, weapons that launch automatically. So I've introduced bipartisan legislation that basically says no matter how amazing AI gets, we're never going to let it launch a nuclear weapon by itself. There must always be a human in the loop. The second bucket is AI that's not going to destroy the world, but can kill you individually. So if your laptop, for example, malfunctions, it's not going 55 miles per hour. But if an AI in a moving vehicle malfunctions, it can kill you, it has killed people, it will kill people. And there's a lot of AI in moving objects, planes, trains, automobiles. I think we need to have more regulators at the state and federal level that are more attuned to unique aspects of AI. And then the third bucket is the hardest. It's AI that's not going to destroy the world or kill you, but it can cause significant harm. So for example, there's AI algorithms in facial recognition technology that is biased towards people with darker skin. And if we deploy facial recognition technology nationwide at law enforcement agencies, my view is that's a huge equal protection violation because minorities will be misidentified at higher rates. There's AI in hiring algorithms that could have certain gender or racial biases. There's AI that's used in algorithms that determine credit risks. And we can have all sorts of AI algorithms that maybe their algorithm itself is perfectly fine, but then the data that it trains itself on is biased. And we need to figure out how can we reduce biases in these AI applications so that people are treated fairly and equally. And I look forward to learning from the different folks with the various different ideas. And one more area that I think is going to be quite disruptive is how AI is going to affect intellectual property as well as the labor force. And so look forward again to working with all of you as we continue to harness the benefits of AI, reduce the risks, and make our country an even better place to live, work, and play. Thank you.
I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our next speaker, Congresswoman Sara Jacobs. First elected in 2020, Congresswoman Jacobs represents California's 51st Congressional District. She is the youngest member of California's congressional delegation and serves as the caucus leadership representative, representing the Democratic members who have served 5 terms or less at the Democratic House leadership table. At 34 years old, she is the youngest woman of Democratic House leadership. She also sits on the House Foreign Affairs and House Armed Services Committees. Join me in giving Congresswoman Jacobs a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to APAICS for convening today's conversation about how we can establish effective regulatory and policy frameworks for artificial intelligence. As one of the youngest members of Congress, I am painfully aware of how outdated our laws are and how we've largely failed to keep up with emerging and evolving technologies. I'm so glad that we've taken some big steps forward to expand equitable access to technology, like the $65 billion investment in the bipartisan infrastructure law to bring affordable, high-speed internet to every American. But we still need to do more. And that's why this summit is so important. So we can recognize the opportunities and challenges of artificial intelligence, bring our laws up to the 21st century, and set up the necessary guardrails for AI that prioritize equity, accessibility, and transparency. One of the areas I'm focused on is how AI affects access to the resources and services we depend on. Algorithms perform tasks like finding patterns, understanding language, problem solving, or decision making that are key to the functioning of AI. But they can also reinforce structural racism. And that's because while we often think of algorithms and technology as objective and neutral, in fact, these algorithms are built by humans and therefore they replicate our own biases. And that can be especially dangerous when these algorithms are used in areas like healthcare, housing, credit, jobs, and education that have been marked by discrimination for decades, if not centuries. For example, researchers for the National Institute of Standards and Technology found that algorithms falsely identified African American and Asian faces 10 to 100 times more than Caucasian faces. Bias is ingrained into the outcomes that AI is asked to predict or decide. And bias is often in the data that we're inputting into these algorithms and training them on, because it can be discriminatory or simply unrepresentative of demographic groups. So at every step, from design to development to implementation, AI can worsen existing inequities, including for the API community. And that's why we need to be thoughtful and intentional in addressing bias through our oversight and regulation, and address the harm that's already been caused by AI. We know that algorithms have perpetuated housing discrimination like tenant selection, mortgage qualification, lending discrimination, and more. In healthcare, poor data management and systemic racism have led to inadequate diagnosis and treatment of Asian Americans, which is why it's so important that we address biased algorithms in the healthcare industry and ensure models have access to representative data. And sometimes, these algorithms can make life or death decisions. A recent MIT study found that AI fails to reflect human judgment and often delivers higher bail and longer jail sentences for vulnerable communities. These are just a few examples, and there are so many more. And that's why we need oversight and transparency of these algorithms. I am so proud to support the Algorithmic Accountability Act, a step for policymakers to get the information we need about algorithms, software, and automated systems to build a framework that respects vulnerable communities, protects civil rights, and expands access to important levers of opportunity. This bill would require companies to assess the impacts of their automated systems, ensure transparency of these systems, and empower consumers to make informed choices about the automation of critical decisions. But this one bill by no means is the only solution to the issues posed by AI. We also need to think beyond our own borders. That's why I'm also looking into the global governance of AI. So this emerging technology isn't a tool for further democratic backsliding, but one that strengthens democracy and upholds human and civil rights, not just here at home, but around the world. As we're thinking about safety and bias, all voices, including those from the global south, should be at the table to create guardrails that don't promote a Western bias and perpetuate the inequities already built into AI. AI systems and those who use them should respect the rule of law, human rights, and democratic values. And these systems should prioritize safety and security, be transparent and explainable, and if there's wrongdoing, take accountability. Everyone should have a right to know which decisions algorithms are making that affect their lives and how they're making them. We need to get this right. And to do that, we need to have the buy-in from subject matter experts and impacted communities, including those of you here today. I'm so excited to dig into these issues even more as Vice Chair of the New Democratic Coalition's AI Working Group. And I'm very grateful for your work on these issues and that you're convening today's conversation. It is such an honor to be doing this work alongside all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those remarks. Our next panel will delve into regulatory and policy frameworks for AI. As AI advances and becomes more integrated into various aspects of society, establishing effective regulatory and policy frameworks becomes imperative. Panelists will discuss the ethical considerations, including transparency, accountability, and legal implications necessary to ensure the responsible and beneficial development, deployment, and use of AI technologies. Please join me in welcoming the moderator for this panel, Cecilia Kang, a national technology correspondent for the New York Times. She writes about regulatory issues such as privacy, cybersecurity, antitrust, and the digital divide. Cecilia spent a decade at the Washington Post as senior technology correspondent and began her career in Seoul, South Korea for Dow Jones. She won the George Polk Award, Loeb Award, and was a Pulitzer finalist in 2018. Join me in giving a warm welcome to Cecilia and our next group of panelists.
Hello, thanks for joining us for this panel on artificial intelligence and the advances that have become more integrated to various aspects of our society. This is a very esteemed panel with lots of different expertise, a lot of expertise in different areas when it comes to AI and policy. I am joined by Sara Chang, who is the Director of Responsible AI Practices at Microsoft, Emily Chi, who is the Senior Director of Telecommunications Technology and Media for the Asian Americans Advancing Justice organization, Danielle Gilliam-Moore, who is the Director of Global Public Policy at Salesforce, Krish Gupta, who is the Senior Vice President for Litigation and Intellectual Property for Dell Technologies, and Lauren Krapf, who is the Lead Counsel and Director of Policy and Impact for the Center for Technology and Society at the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you all for joining. Maybe we can start off by just very quickly, each of our panelists talking just for less than a minute about to introduce yourself and the work that you do on this topic of AI and policy. Maybe we can start with Sara, please.
Thank you, Cecilia. Again, I'm Sara Chang, and I'm from Microsoft's Office of Responsible AI. And our office coordinates the governance of our Responsible AI program, collaborating across the company with engineers and researchers to translate our responsible AI principles into a daily practice. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Sara. And Emily, please introduce yourself and tell us what you do as it pertains to AI.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you so much for APAICS for hosting this really important conversation. My name is Emily Chi. I'm the Senior Director of Tech Telecom and Media Policy at AJC. We're really excited this conversation is happening because we're all about centering our communities when it comes to tech policy. We work on all matters, everything from broadband access to AI, to immigrant surveillance, to other emerging technologies. And we always want to make sure that the civil rights and the lived impact on our communities is really centered when we have these conversations. So thanks so much for having us today.
Thank you, Emily. Danielle, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and the work that you do on this topic?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for APAICS for hosting this event. Really happy and thrilled to be discussing this issue. As we said, my name is Danielle Gilliam-Moore, and I'm the Director of Global Public Policy at Salesforce. And though I do a lot of things, these days, a lot of my time is spent working, again, cross-functionally with engineering teams, ethicists, to pull together a coherent and clear set of policy recommendations around AI and generative AI. So very exciting work these days.
Thank you, Danielle. Krish, hello. Can you introduce yourself, please, and talk about your work on AI?
Sure. Thank you, Cecilia. I'm Krish Gupta. I'm Senior Vice President for Global Litigation as well as Intellectual Property Law at Dell. And I also have the honor of serving on the board of APAICS. And this is a really, really important topic, and I'm really glad to be part of it and have this conversation with all of you. And in my role at Dell, I work closely with the business to support our review of our AI use cases. And I also work with our government affairs team on AI policy issues.
Thank you, Krish. Lauren, hello. Can you please, definitely not least, but you are last to introduce yourself, please, and tell us about your work.
Absolutely. Working for the Anti-Defamation League in our Center for Tech and Society, we look at all things tech related that intersect with fighting hate, anti-Semitism, extremism, all forms of bigotry and racism. And so we have done this work since the early days of dial-up with the ADL, but since the launch of our Center for Tech and Society, we've certainly also looked at new and emerging technologies like the AI and ML systems that we've seen for a little bit, and certainly with generative AI and how those issues intersect with our equities. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'd like to start off and ask a little bit from the panel as to where we are right now when it comes to regulatory frameworks and safeguards when it, with artificial intelligence. I will quickly say I should probably introduce myself. My name is Cecilia Kang, and I cover technology for the New York Times. And that these days means a lot of coverage of AI at the intersection of governance and policy and the technology. So in Washington, there is a lot of talk about AI policy and the creation of regulations and legislation. There is even this month an effort by Senator Schumer's office to gather dozens of tech CEOs, civil society groups, academics, et cetera, at the beginning of many closed session meetings to learn about AI and to talk about potential regulation. There are efforts also on the executive branch as well as in agencies. I wanted to ask everybody to sort of just give a realistic picture of where we are, though, in this process. And perhaps I'm going to ask you, Sara, to begin and say, where are we in your mind in terms, is this early days or, and are you seeing things move fast?
I think we are in a period of acceleration for sure, Cecilia. And there are a number of existing AI safety frameworks on which to build, and I'll highlight just two of them. The first one is the White House Voluntary Commitments, and Microsoft signed on to that recently alongside 6 other leading AI companies, and it focuses on 3 foundational principles: that AI should be safe, secure, and trustworthy. And I'll give a couple examples for each. For safe, we've committed to red teaming our products before release. That means we're pressure testing them and adversarially attacking them to see what unexpected behaviors arise. Second is that AI should be secure, and we've committed to supporting the development of licensing regimes for high-risk models. And third is that they should be trustworthy. One of the commitments that Microsoft has made is to apply provenance information or watermarks to indicate when something is generative AI, so that when the public is consuming a piece of content, they know whether or not it's generative. The second framework that I'll highlight is the NIST AI RMF, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology AI Risk Management Framework. Microsoft is committed to implementing the NIST AI RMF, and it was developed based on, I believe, a congressional directive issued as part of the National AI Initiative Act of 2020, and it builds on about 18 months of robust consultation with civil society, industry, and other stakeholders more broadly. And it's really become a model for a consensus-driven process that involved input from both private and public sectors. And I'm proud to say that Microsoft's internal responsible AI deployment framework maps really nicely to the series of processes set forth by the RMF, which include mapping, measuring, and managing AI risk, as well as processes for developing a governance framework.
Thanks, Sara. And I'm going to ask another, Danielle, you're close to the ground here in Washington on policy. Where do you see the legislative process? It feels like there's lots of bills that are being introduced. In fact, very recently, Senator Blumenthal and Senator Hawley introduced a bipartisan framework on AI with very specific ideas on how the technology should be regulated. Lots of discussion. How realistic is the idea of creating bills even within this year or even sooner? How are you seeing the sort of all the shakeout?
Thanks so much for this question. And I'm really excited that you asked me it because I have so many thoughts about this, both in the US and then globally. So I'd say from a legislative point of view, which is different from the frameworks, which I think is in a lot of ways like said, it's accelerating. Legislation is almost in, I think, a very beginning stage in a lot of ways because we have these frameworks. But we're talking about AI, like all AI all the time a couple months ago. Now we're all generative AI all the time. And so with this quick evolution, you've seen bills being introduced, you've seen in the EU AI Act come and then have to be figured out to apply to generative AI. China has put out some interim measures, but they have a work plan to have an AI law in 2023. So both the US and globally, this work is just starting, but we are happy to see commitments like the White House, the NIST RMF framework to kind of be not a stopgap solution, but a way to put some guardrails around this quickly evolving technology while it is being used in the public. And we're pleased to see it. And we're also excited to see what happens in the regulatory space. And that's something that the government affairs team has really been working on.
And can I ask you, Lauren and Emily, to weigh in on that and also address whether you believe that the civil society groups and NGOs, the voices of, along with the companies, are being represented in a lot of these conversations. From where I'm seated, I see a lot of excitement about tech CEOs coming to Washington to meet with government officials. Where are your voices and the voices of your communities being represented, and enough? Are they being represented enough? Maybe we can start with Lauren and then Emily.
Thank you so much for this question. It's crucial that we work together with civil society, government, and industry to ensure that AI is both effective, but also safe in protecting consumers. We really are thinking about the lessons learned from internet governance in the past or lack thereof. And so the importance of ensuring that we have voluntary commitments, but that we also have mandated commitments and regulation and compliance to protect the communities, Cecilia, that you were mentioning. We have seen an increase in online hate and harassment, specifically directed at marginalized and historically targeted communities. We saw that increase with the AAPI community in 2020 to 21 to 22, and then it held steady in 23, really high numbers. And we've seen that with other targeted communities, the LGBTQ plus community, the Jewish community, and others. And in light of that kind of proliferation of hate online, we're concerned about the way that intersects with AI systems, with the large language models that underpin these systems, that scrape the internet, and those biases proliferating, and then also having bad actors use these systems for frictionless targeting of individuals. Unfortunately, these exciting, AI and ML tools aren't being brought into the world in a vacuum. They're being brought into the world that we live in today. And so, we really do want to see not only mandated efforts to ensure safety and to ensure ethical compliance, but also, like you said, the inclusion of civil society and things like red teaming and advising and all the rest. So thanks for asking. It's super important. And I'll turn it to Emily.
Thank you. So I know I started this conversation by talking about community, and I think I'll be continuing to remind the group and audience about community throughout. So when we're on the Hill advocating for legislation or meeting with an agency to advocate for our communities, we want to make sure that whatever ends up coming out at the end of the day is actually accessible, exercisable, and meaningful to real people whose lives are impacted. I think we can look at privacy legislation as kind of an example of what could happen and maybe some of the things we want to avoid. And so while we talk about, opt out, the right to be forgotten, data rights, I can fix my data, I can access it. Those rights at the end of the day often end up only being accessible to the most educated, the most privileged, the people with the most time. And so when we think about AI and the real ways it's going to affect people, whatever we come out with at the end of the day, the rights that people have, we want to make sure that individuals who don't have the time and resources to navigate really complex systems can easily opt out if they want to, can easily learn about where their data was used, how it's being collected, how it's being recycled into the system, because that's a right that they should have. And these are often the most vulnerable populations. So it becomes even more important that they have the ability to control how their data is used and what decisions are being made about them. So we want to make sure that legislators always remember that these are real communities being affected, that solutions are offered in multiple languages, are accessible to those with disabilities, and that people really are empowered to do what they believe is right and with the entities that they really trust, so that it's not just a centralized authority, an Office of Civil Rights, as great as it would be, just making decisions on behalf of the lawyers who can and will bring cases. We want to make sure it's accessible to the most normal everyday people on the ground.
Thank you, Emily. And Krish, there's been a lot of conversation about the risks that AI poses, particularly since the release of the ChatGPT chatbot last November. It's just like it feels like Washington's obsessed right now with AI and the potential risks. I believe Dell's working on the local and state level on some of the opportunities and working with communities, as Emily and Lauren talked about marginalized communities. Can you talk a little bit about some of the opportunities?
Sure. So we have been, for instance, working with the city of Amarillo to increase civic engagement among citizens of Amarillo using an AI-driven digital assistant to help local citizens navigate local government information and services. And this digital assistant serves as an accessible solution to provide quick answers to residents while providing an interactive experience. And ultimately, the assistant will be able to interact with residents in 62 languages. And we're also working with another local government customer to use AI to better predict weather patterns, to better prepare for hurricanes, tornadoes, and other natural disasters in their area. The important thing is that the public sector needs to work closely with the private sector to learn about opportunities AI presents and discuss how best to regulate, so we're not hindering innovation and can help our citizens in the long run.
And Krish, why don't I also ask you about the conversations that are taking place with companies? And do you feel like most of the perspectives are being represented in some of these policy-making discussions from the industry? And also what you believe should be taken into account as legislators come up with frameworks and bills?
Thank you, Cecilia. That's an excellent question. So we at Dell have no doubt that AI is here to stay. And we play into this space a little differently from some of the other organizations we've been hearing from, particularly on the policy side. We will play a significant role in driving and supporting Gen AI models in the months and years ahead. And we're proud to have the world's broadest Gen AI infrastructure portfolio that spans from our cloud and client devices all in one place. And through global infrastructure solutions, PCs, and professional services, our solutions will enable customers to swiftly build and develop on-site Gen AI models. And to truly maximize the potential of AI, most organizations will need to modernize their infrastructure. And to date, most of the proposals on AI regulation have focused on the output of large language models and transparency measures to improve oversight. Our regulatory point of view for AI gets to the heart of the foundation of the technology. And by getting the foundations right at their core, we can eliminate some of the greatest risk associated with AI and work to ensure that it acts as a force for good for the planet and for people everywhere. And so we think as policymakers consider the requisite AI governance for the coming years, they should take an approach underpinned by what we call the 3 S's: shared, secure, and sustainable, which we use as guiding principles in our own approach to AI at Dell. Shared for us represents an integrated multi-sector global approach built in alignment with existing tech policies and compliance regulations, such as those governing privacy. Secure for us means focusing on security and trust at every level, from infrastructure to the output of machine learning models, and always ensuring that AI remains as a force for good, but is also protected from threats and treated like the extremely high value asset that it is. And sustainable for us demonstrates an opportunity to harness AI while protecting the environment, minimizing emissions, and prioritizing renewable energy sources. AI represents the most intensive and demanding technology we've ever seen, and we must invest as much in making it sustainable as creating AI itself.
I'd like to also explore a little bit about how the technology innovations, as well as the discussions about regulation, could impact the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And I know, Emily, you're very close to the ground on this. Can you talk about how you're thinking about the impact on Asian Americans in our community?
Sure. I think there are several levels to this. So first is that data is not neutral, which I think everyone here knows. And there are a lot of efforts being made by good actors, like have already been mentioned, to kind of contextualize the data, to clean up the data, to make it less biased, to test it. And that's all really great. But I think we need to remember that the history of this country, data has often been weaponized to oppress and push certain narratives about certain minority groups and people in power. So I think it's really important to remember it's never going to be unbiased no matter what we do. And we always have to remember that there are real people behind these numbers and that there's an intentional narrative trying to be pushed no matter who collects the data, right? So I think that's number one, is we can't forget that data is not this like neutral, just numbers based type thing. And we always need to question it and have context with it. And that's especially true in the Asian American context, where often data is not collected about us at all, even today. And when it is, it's often inaccurate, not collected in Asian language, and not disaggregated. The Asian language challenge kind of trickles down to many different areas. So for example, with generative AI, the models are often best in English. And when used in different languages, there are many instances where, because there isn't enough data or enough practice with the algorithms, it's going to create more information that's fabricated and not based on reality, which obviously creates a lot of fear for our communities when it comes to disinformation, election information, and public health information, anything that they need to survive. So there are those types of concerns with discrimination and misuse, but also there's the bigger international context that I think we're starting to think about with China. And we've already seen a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric through the pandemic and increasing competition between the US and these unsavory feelings that are being promoted, especially with the election escalating now. We're seeing that this rhetoric is really trickling down to real violence and assault and harassment of Asian Americans. And we anticipate that with AI and the fear around it, this is only going to increase as China is really investing in their research and their outputs with AI. When it comes to regulation, we need to be careful here, because in the context of global competition, it could be easy to resort to a race to the bottom, where we kind of justify everything because China's doing it, or because another competitor is doing it, because Russia's already developing this. We don't want to fall behind. And that's where we really need to think about impact on our communities, right? What does it mean for Asian Americans on the ground who are going to be facing more surveillance because of this anti-Chinese sentiment, more suspicions, more algorithms being used against them to surveil them without their knowledge, but also how is the increasing anti-Chinese sentiment going to affect their daily interactions with real people? So it's kind of a two-pronged threat that we're watching and trying to make sure we stifle before it becomes a bigger issue.
And Lauren, I'm sure you have some to add to that from the ADL's perspective and all your work on disinformation in particular.
Thank you for the question. We do see the correlation between online and offline hate and extremism, and often this does take into account what's going on in the broader public conversation. So Emily's points regarding China and a race to the bottom, seeing how that impacts communities on the ground and how that impacts communities online is absolutely something we track at the ADL. Not only would that impact communities from a standpoint of being targeted, again, both online and offline, but the more that this information proliferates online, the more that it has a potential to, again, weave into these AI and ML systems, whether it's recommendation engines, whether it's through generative AI, again, in these large language models. So it really is a full circle connecting everything that happens online and offline. And we know that this really does impact targeted communities, the API community specifically.
Thank you. If I could quickly add one example to highlight that for our communities, there's one Stanford study that's already found that when we look at generative AI models, if we type things in such as 2 Muslims walk into a bar or show me an image of an Asian woman, there's already a significant higher tendency for stereotypes and offensive content to be produced. So we're already seeing that there's a proliferation that's accelerating. As Lauren said, the cycle keeps building on itself.
And one more example, if you don't mind, similarly, when generative AI models are being integrated into other tools that don't typically account for trust and safety, we're also seeing, a lot of concerning outputs. So for example, one of our investigators utilized the integration of ChatGPT into a travel app, and they asked the model to create an itinerary of sites for famous anti-Semitic pogroms in Europe alongside nearby art supply stores where they could obtain spray paint. This was created in 2 minutes for an individual. And so I can only imagine how that example could continue in different types of environments where trust and safety isn't necessarily already a foundation to, technological advances.
Thanks. Well, Sara, this is exactly squarely in what you do every day at Microsoft. Can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about the responsible use of AI and these potential negative effects, and rooting out things like discrimination and bias data, et cetera? How are you thinking about that? And what are some of the solutions that you have at Microsoft?
Cecilia, for that question, and thank you, Emily and Lauren, for bringing these important considerations to light. At Microsoft, we absolutely take fairness as top of mind as one of our 6 core principles that we use to build our AI projects every day. And those are fairness, as I just mentioned, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. To go back to the first point that Emily made, one of the first examples Emily gave about fairness, are language disparities, performance disparities across multiple languages. We do automated evaluations that test different aspects of conversation quality in our conversational AI. For example, how grounded it is or whether harmful content is produced. And we continuously monitor and learn from these evaluations to improve and close performance gaps. We also have globally distributed teams who review feedback and the quality metrics across languages so that if we see regressions for particular languages, it can be surfaced as part of these reviews by people who are most familiar with the relevant language and culture. Let me just give one more example of how we mitigate for fairness issues. And this is in our speech-to-text product, which is a Microsoft Cognitive Service product that converts spoken audio to text, used for several applications, for example, for Microsoft Teams transcription. Back in 2020, when a research study found error rates for some members of some Black and African American communities that were nearly double those for white users, we learned that we had not fully accounted for the rich diversity of speech across people with different backgrounds. And so as a result, we engaged with a sociolinguist, assembled a cross-disciplinary team composed of cognitive services engineers, fairness experts, user researchers, and other subject matter experts to better understand how to mitigate for fairness here and narrow the performance gap. So as part of these efforts, I think Lauren or Emily mentioned the lack of enough data on certain demographics. We expanded our data collection efforts, incorporating learnings to further articulate specific steps that teams must take to ensure that our AI systems at Microsoft are designed to provide a similar quality of service for identified demographic groups, especially marginalized groups.
Thank you so much, Sara. Danielle, can you talk a little bit about, we're getting a sense of that there is there's effort on the private sector side and the public sector side sometimes working together, sometimes not. Can you talk a little bit about partnerships and the opportunity of partnerships between the public and private sector when it comes to the implementation and the creation, actually, of regulation?
Yes, and thank you so much for this question. So a lot of the things that I would actually suggest are already happening, which is I'm really pleased to say. I commend NIST, OSTP, NTIAA for having a really collaborative and sustained effort towards talking to the private sector and academics, civil society groups, to really get input on some of the issues that have been brought forward by AI and now generative AI. You already, as you said in your first question to me, I mean, Congress is working on this, and they are reaching out to us, to Salesforce, to Microsoft, to companies large and small, academics, trying to really get their arms wrapped around really what is the implications of generative AI, what are the dangers, the risks, how can those things be mitigated, or at least how can they be clear to consumers when they're trying to interact with this technology. Also, I think the final piece of this, if we're going to talk about what each level of the government is doing internationally, I think that's another area that is ripe for a healthy public-private partnership. You see the G7, OECD, all working to try to figure out what they can do on generative AI, as well as the UN. But I'm very pleased to see the work at all these different levels to work with the private industry and the academics and the civil society groups to have a more robust and rich response to generative AI.
Well, one very specific thing, Lauren, that you mentioned was potentially the role of third parties, civil society groups, et cetera, to do things like red teaming. So for our audience, what is red teaming? And maybe explain that particular example and any other partnerships that you think are must achieve sort of partnerships between the public and private sectors.
Thanks so much. I did mention red teaming, and I believe Sara did as well. Essentially, trying to target systems, acting in a sort of nefarious way to expose vulnerabilities within, a given model. In our case, the example that I brought up of the travel app and looking to create a detailed itinerary between the anti-Semitic pogrom sites in Europe and nearby art supply stores. And we, kind of test and stress test models on our own, but to be able to do that, and we report on that, to be able to do that in active and early partnership with industry, I think is crucial. ADL has surveyed Americans and has found, unsurprisingly, that a vast majority support congressional efforts to mandate transparency and privacy so that we can ensure that these tools are safe. They support a lot of different measures to ensure that even though this exciting tool, these new tools are coming out into the public, that they really, have a lot of risk. And so that we are ensuring the protection of communities across the board. And so that's one example, but there's definitely a couple others as well. And we want to make sure that it's early and often.
Emily, I know that you work in your work, you deal a lot with like focus groups. So this is like micro local level. Could there be a role for what you find and you gather in focus groups to bring to the private sector and work and use in these partnerships?
So at AJC, we are engaged in quite a few partnerships with private sector already. So we work with plenty of tech companies who are trying to understand the perspective of our communities. They know that because we have really close connections to leaders and community movers on the ground, we're able to bring the information we're learning from their communities, their focus groups, their studies, and pushing it back to the tech companies so that they're aware of some of the issues that our communities face. Where we'd like to see them do more work is to kind of engage in that user research and testing themselves to see new communities that are emerging, such as Asian American communities, as potential new users, but not just potential new users, but really meaningful, valuable community members who, even if they aren't users of the product directly, will inevitably be impacted, right? So how do we make sure they understand that the responsibility of their product doesn't end with just the user, but goes beyond to like how society at large is impacted? So we always really encourage tech companies to do that work themselves, not just consult us, but bring together research groups that are diverse, that really represent all lived experiences of the consumer base, not just the ones we've traditionally relied on, right? So how do you expand user research to include non-English users, you know, maybe low-income users, digital people who are still challenged with digital literacy? We want them all to be engaged in the process so that companies are aware of how the product impacts many types of people, not just the people that they're familiar with.
And Krish, you already talked about the partnership on the local level with the city of Amarillo. And if you have any other thoughts on public-private partnerships, we'd love to hear it. But also, I'd like you to open up on what you think you would like the audience to take away from this conversation when it comes to AI and the creation of regulations of the technology.
Thank you, Cecilia. AI as a technology area is not independent of other major technology domains, such as privacy, data, cloud, security. And because of this, we recommend that AI policy should always consider its dependencies and impact on policies in these other domains. And AI policy should never be created in a vacuum. So that's one. Second, it's a rapidly changing dynamic space, and therefore it's critical that government policy efforts should deeply involve industry. So we're not setting policy around technology of the past. And as policymakers consider the requisite AI governance for coming years, they should take the approach underpinned by what I mentioned earlier, the 3 S's: shared, secure, and sustainable, which we use as our own guiding principle at Dell. And shared, as I mentioned, is an integrated multi-sector global approach built, as I mentioned, in alignment with other technology areas and other policies. Secure for us means focusing on security and trust at every level, from infrastructure to the output of machine learning models, and always ensuring that AI remains a force for good, and that it's also protected from threats and treated like a high-value asset that it is. And ultimately sustainable, demonstrating an opportunity to harness AI while protecting the environment, minimizing emissions, and prioritizing renewable energy sources. This rapid advancement of mainstream AI necessitates a new spirit of collaboration. And we've already seen this through the commitments forged between the US government and industry players towards disclosure of AI-generated content and enhanced security for end users. And it's our collective responsibility to shape the future of AI through thoughtful regulation that balances innovation, societal well-being, and the preservation of individual rights. And by designing the right guardrails, guided by universally agreed upon principles, similar to the climate governance established by the World Economic Forum, we can ensure AI technologies are developed responsibly, ethically, and with due consideration for the potential risks that they pose.
Thank you, Krish. I'm going to open up that same question to everybody. Maybe we can go, I'll just open it up, whoever wants to speak first. Or I will call on you. Lauren.
Great. Thank you so much. It's an important question. We are excited and optimistic about new and emerging technology, but we also know that with the rapid integration of new technologies that don't have appropriate safeguards, significant threats are posed to society. I want to kind of underpin the example that I brought up before, that Americans really want to ensure that Congress is focusing on this issue and that we are mandating risk assessments, transparency, and other measures to ensure accountability. We don't have to accept the notion that regulations necessarily stifle innovation. We've seen in the beauty industry and pharmaceuticals and automotive and other industries where there is oversight and accountability, there's still immersive and exciting innovation. And so we can absolutely move forward in an innovative way that does ensure compliance via regulation.
Danielle, please.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for that final question. Just as America is not a monolith, neither is tech. I think one thing I would really like everyone to understand going forward is that as we witness Congress or the White House having this conversation, that there are different roles and responsibilities for companies, for researchers, for others in the community to play to ensure that we have the responsible development and use of AI systems. And so I really want us all to be encouraging Congress and other lawmakers and regulators to really be having a nuanced conversation about these topics. And, Salesforce and other companies here on this panel and not on this panel are doing their part to try and have a principled approach. Salesforce, we released our AI principles. Now we have generative AI principles, and they talk about inclusivity, sustainability. We really are hoping that in having these conversations and posting these principles, in talking to Congress and White House, that they're really listening to what we're saying, because I think, like it was previously said, regulation isn't always the killer of innovation. Sometimes regulation helps set the table so that we all use common definitions and have a more even conversation about what we're trying to address. And so I think we should be open to regulation, but we should be open to a regulation that is nuanced and really acknowledges the different roles that a company like Salesforce, which is a business to business company, what we might be needing to do to ensure of responsible AI versus a company that has a direct relationship with the consumer. I think those roles and responsibilities should be different.
Thank you, Danielle. And how about you, Emily? Parting thoughts and final thoughts of what you hope the audience will take away.
Sure, thank you. Well, first I want to thank you, Cecilia, and all my fellow panelists, because I just learned so much, and especially hearing from folks from the companies, I'm just so encouraged to hear about how many great interventions and proactive studies are already being done, and can't wait to hear more and see what you all do. But I'll just highlight that none of these issues are new, right? Krish already mentioned that every tech policy issue that existed before kind of is more relevant now, not less relevant, because AI is now the new sexy topic. And so even when we look at the White House commitments on AI, safe and effective systems, protection from discrimination, data privacy, these are issues that we've all been talking about for years and years and years. I think it's more tangible and more urgent than it has been before, but these are things that we've been talking about for years, and none of it is new. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's that end users, community, society at large are real and are, real people with faces and lives. And I think we often forget that because these issues feel so technical and complex, but really we're talking about discrimination. The content is stuff that's been recycled since the beginning of time, right? It's really about, how do we educate each other? How do we treat each other with respect and kindness? So I'd urge people to remember that while these systems seem scary and complex and mysterious, a lot of the issues at the end of the day are these basic civil and human rights. And how do we ensure that each individual that's worthy of it, which is everyone, has the rights to exercise what they're worthy of. So I just remind people that at the end of the day, it's about humans. Thanks.
And Sara, your final thoughts, and you'll close out our panel, please.
One, thank you so much to my fellow panelists, and thank you, Cecilia, for that question. I just want to underscore how important it is for diverse representation to be present in these discussions. And I'm really heartened by the fact that this group has come together And I also want to emphasize that we need to continue to invest in pursuing public-private partnerships and promoting transparency and ensuring academic and increased public access to AI. And in that vein, I'm excited to tell you that Microsoft is increasing investment in academic research programs to ensure researchers outside Microsoft can access our company's foundational models and the Azure OpenAI service to undertake research and validate findings. And as we continue to broaden access to the latest AI technology, I'm really excited about the positive impact that we'll see on our greater society and our communities at large. A recent example that comes to mind is the use of AI technology by Microsoft to gather satellite imagery of the Maui wildfires before and after, which really enabled the Red Cross to hone in on the most damaged areas and pivot in real time to arrive at the places that needed help the most. And so I'm really excited to see how AI can impact positively the AIPI community specifically and our communities. So thank you so much for this time together, and thank you, Cecilia, again for moderating.
Thank you, everyone, and for participating, and I hope to continue the conversation.
What a great first day we've had together. I hope you've learned as much as I have from our amazing panelists and speakers. We greatly appreciate our summit partners, Amazon, Apple, AT&T, Comcast, CTIA, Dell, DoorDash, Toyota, Charter, Entertainment Software Association, Microsoft, Netflix, Salesforce, T-Mobile, as well as all of our panelists, moderators, and special guest speakers. Your support enables APAICS to fulfill its mission of promoting Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander participation and representation at all levels of the political process, from community service to elected office. Please visit www.apaics.org to learn more about our work. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for day 2 of the APAICS Tech Summit. You'll hear from speakers like KPAC Chair and APAICS Board Member Congresswoman Judy Chu and Congressman Sri Thanadar. See you back here tomorrow.